a huge thank you to Claire Tobin and Maureen Milmore, who both worked tirelessly to put this event together. So you have them to thank for the excellent. I also want to just note that we'll have some time after the presentation to just talk with each other and be in conversation together. We have some refreshments from a business called Feeding the Multitudes. They work with one of the Denver Foundation's grantees, the Center for Community Wealth Building, who supports all kinds of entrepreneurs in the metro area. So this topic I know is near and dear to many people's hearts. It's really one of those spaces where you just have an opportunity to play out your set of personal values, your love of the people in your life, and your commitment to community and making a difference in community. And so we're going to hear from three really wonderful speakers today, just in a little bit of a conversational style per usual for these. So first on the screen, we have Julie Naster coming to us from Leadville. She's unable to get back down to the metro area, so we'll have her on the large screen today, but she's been a fund holder at the Denver Foundation since 2018. She actually started her career with some work in chemical engineering and is now doing leadership coaching. So a wide range of talents embodied in this woman. Sitting next to me is Sarah Scofield. She's with Scofield Law. It's a New York and Colorado-based law firm that is focused on trusts, estates, business, and real estate. So she'll bring that perspective to our conversation. And then Breit is the Senior Vice President at CCS Fundraising and has a really nice kind of broad view of the sector. And so we'll bring that to us as well. So I'm gonna sit down and we'll just dive in. And Julie, I'm gonna go ahead and start with you. And wonder if you could just, tell us the story of how you initially became involved with the Denver Foundation, and more broadly, what has your life path been like to becoming a philanthropist?
So I became, as you mentioned, I became involved in 2018. My mother passed away in June of 2018, and as part of her kind of her distribution of her estate, she earmarked a good chunk for it wasn't specified to the Denver Foundation, but it was for a charitable cause. And she had kind of mentioned over the years that she had started a fund in the name of my older sister who had passed away many years ago, and had started a fund that actually went to the Aspen Music Festival for a number of years. But we never really talked about it too much. And, I think it was kind of late in her life that we actually were able to get down to business, I think, in terms of talking about her estate and her wishes. And it was actually difficult. So I'm just going to be really honest here, because I'm probably not the only one who's been in this situation. But it wasn't something that she wanted to talk about. I think she was planning to live forever. I'm pretty sure that was the plan. And of course I was fully aware that wasn't going to happen and we needed to do things. So anyway, I think, we got through that process. I wouldn't say we really had much discussion about her wishes. And so when the time came and she did pass and I was executing her estate, I felt like it just made total sense to put that money with the Denver Foundation. And so we did that and just began the conversation. I think a really obvious thing that would honor her was she was the founder, or actually a co-founder, I think, along with Carl Topolo in the early to mid 70s of the Denver Young Artists Orchestra. And so that had really been just a huge legacy of hers. And we wanted to make sure my children and I, who are also were part of this process, wanted to make sure that that was well taken care of. And so we had a meeting early on, and I don't know, am I going on too long? Like, do you want to ask them different questions, or was that enough, or should I keep going?
You can say a few more things, please.
Okay, I'll just say a few more things. That we had a process with, it was myself and my daughter Gwynnie and son Peter, and it actually was facilitated at the Denver Foundation. So we had a couple, I don't think they're people who are still there now, but a couple of people helped facilitate that conversation. And we talked about what we thought was sort of a respectful and loving memorial to their grandmother, to my mother. And so a part of that agreement was that, you know, we came up with a total amount of money, and a quarter of that would go every year to the Young Artists Orchestra. So we have lived up to that, and that's been great to kind of be involved at whatever level we want with them. And then we sort of took it from there. And I won't talk about that now, because I think it gets into more conversations about involving the following generations.
Thank you. What a lovely way to start us off. Sarah, maybe you could talk a little bit about how philanthropy has been connected to your life, both personally and professionally. And in particular, I mean, how does it complement the real estate work, the business succession work, you know, those other pieces that you're doing in your professional life?
Well, you know, on the philanthropy side, I feel like I started early on in my career personally, doing various different volunteer work, tutoring, and then various different things that I really loved. Junior achievement was great. We did financial planning issues and literacy for 7-year-olds, because I thought, now what group could not ask me any questions I wouldn't know the answer to? They were the oldest I could get, and I love that. But what really changed my thinking and my whole thought about philanthropy was being on the social board of an organization called the Opening Act in New York. The Opening Act basically pairs actors, professionals in the acting arena with high school students for after school program in economically distressed areas where a lot of the schools had cut the arts funding. And what I loved about it is that there were so many life lessons in trust and mutual accountability and responsibility and showing up for your team, basically, and how they were all able to work together and hold the volunteers and the students, everyone holding each other accountable to create a really great production at the end of the year that they did all of the script to. So I love that. And for the second part of your question, on the professional side, there has been in the estate planning arena, obviously, it's a big question on how much assets will people leave to their kids versus to their philanthropic endeavors. And part of that discussion and part of the understanding of how that actually is a discussion that involves so much more than how we're actually going to draft your documents and, you know, what percentages will go where is what brought me to launch Open Field Consulting, which has the conversations with the families, facilitating an open and honest communication about what the various generations are thinking they want to do, so that that can drive the legal process. And one of the biggest factors in bringing people together, because as we all know, the different generations have different views on a lot of things. And so if the question is, will you be a part of the family enterprise? Do you need to have a career, or you're just going to have a job and kind of like write poetry, which will be enlightening for many people? All of these questions involve, you know, basically how much money are they gonna get and what the family expectations are and what the legacy is. And the factor in bringing people together, I have often found is the philanthropic discussion. What are the values? And I know we're gonna hear, more about that today, but those have been highlights for me.
Thank you, Sarah. I think you have a fellow fan of junior achievement and Charlie Atkins over here. I can remember him talking about them passionately in one grant review round. So maybe you can connect about that later. I'm gonna pop back up to Julie for a second, and I wonder if you might just pick your story up and get a little more specific about how you've involved your children in your grant making. Do you make decisions separately and throw them together? Do you decide together? Do you have a mission statement? How do you do it? People do it all different ways.
Yeah, well, I think this is a little embarrassing, but I think we had some notes from that initial meeting and I couldn't find them. So we did have some, I don't know if it was a mission statement per se, but some, sharing of kind of a shared purpose, I guess would be a good way to say that. And, we were very much in agreement about the Denver Young Artists grant that would happen on an annual basis. And then we decided that what was left for the annual, what kind of was the amount that we thought was appropriate to grant every year, that we would reserve $2,000 to immediate needs, like during COVID, we gave that to some different community organizations that were trying to help get their arms around that. And, for just any, like a big disaster that would happen, that sort of thing. So we agreed on that. I think we're maybe having a little trouble executing, but I think it's good. My kids are very busy with their jobs and families, so it's a little hard in that realm. And then the remaining was that we each had a sum that we were completely could do whatever we wanted with. And I think that's been really interesting. So since I knew I was going to be on this panel, I had conversations with both my kids because we hadn't talked about it much. And I wanted to find out how they were feeling about it, not just what they were doing, because that was sort of easy to see, but how that process was kind of affecting them on a emotional level and, how it was going. And so I do think that we've all landed on a follow your heart approach. And so really trying to hone in on what is personally important to us and then translating that into a well-placed grant. And that requires, research and, hopefully getting a little feedback at times from the organization. And we're still finding our way, but I think that is sort of our shared approach.
Thanks. Sounds like you're pursuing that really thoughtfully. Holly, let's scope up and hear from you about some pieces of the landscape. And in particular, what are you seeing in terms of the kind of biggest philanthropic giving trends? And are you seeing any differences from the younger generation and the older generations?
Yeah, great question. I was joking that I'm glad I have a space to have this conversation because otherwise I bring it up at dinner and with audiences who aren't as excited about the data around it. So good to see you all. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. I'm going to start just at a high level because there's some really interesting things that have happened over the last several years, and then talk about some specific sector trends that we're seeing and then generational trends as well. So big picture, CCS works every year with Indiana University, Lilly School of Philanthropy, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And they produce the Giving USA report that looks at data around giving every year. So a couple things that are interesting. 2021 was the most philanthropic year on record. So for the first time in history, philanthropy passed the $500 billion mark. This year, we just got preliminary data. We'll adjust it in the fall. It looks like there's a slight dip this year, and we think there's a couple of reasons for that. But this data goes back 40 years, so 1982. Philanthropy is incredibly resilient. So we do feasibility and planning studies with organizations across sectors. And there's so many different environmental factors, things that are going on in the world. And we always hear, is this the year to do a campaign? Is this the year to raise our aspirations, given what's happening in the markets, given what's happening globally, environmentally? And what we've learned, we do see some trends with that, but philanthropy tends to be about 2% of GDP. So anywhere between 1.7 to 2.3% of GDP, and it's resilient, we've seen. So as far as some of the sectors, I think one of the best parts of my job, I think about this a lot. Do you know the definition of philanthropy? Anyone know that? It's the love for humankind. And I'm like, how awesome to work in a sector that is about the love for humankind when you hear these stories. And we've seen a couple of different trends. So giving to religious organization can, when you think of the $500 million in philanthropic activity, about 27% of that is to religious organizations. So the lion's share continues to be to religious organizations. What's interesting about that, however, since the late 1980s, the increase is relatively flat. So it continues to climb, but at a slow pace compared to some other sectors. So human services in the last few years is something we're really paying attention to. So it's only 14% of the overall pie, but when you look at the rate of increase in giving to human services, it's a large increase year over year. Something in 2022 that we're really paying attention to is global affairs. So people respond to urgent crises. They also respond, anywhere around the globe, there's a lot of need. The media plays a big role in this, of where the stories are coming from. So what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is there's a lot of philanthropic attention there. So we've seen a huge increase, 30%. In international affairs in recent years. Should I jump down to some generational trends? So a couple, and I love, Julie, hearing your story and conversations that are happening. A couple of things that we're seeing. So younger generations, they're looking holistically at their impact. So it's not just dollars to 501c3 organizations, but what are the various ways that I can expand my impact in this? So impact investing is a big area. They're looking, this is the first time in history that we're seeing more people are voting than are giving to 501c3s. So they're looking at, really want to be part of social causes. They're looking at volunteer, right? So you have your time, you have your treasure. And what are the various ways that I can demonstrate my values? Philanthropy is included in that. So the actual charitable dollars is included in that. But for younger generations, we're seeing there's a broad number of ways that younger generations are engaging in philanthropy. And then I'll pause and take a breath. But the area, I was thinking about this, what is the area I personally am most surprised about? And it's the environment. So giving to environmental causes, animal welfare is included in that, is only 3% of the overall pie. When you look at, this contradicts a little bit of what I've said, of people respond to urgent, tangible crises where they have an impact. And we've talked a lot about that at our firm of what is the reason. So number one, hopefully we will be in this room in 5 years and we will see a big uptick in giving to environmental causes. But we've seen a few things. One is people don't know how to engage philanthropically with environmental causes. So they're doing things like getting electric vehicles, moving over to solar, for example, but some of the environmental organizations feel vague and hard to access. The number one reason people give is the impact of their dollars. So when we survey donors, 90% say the number one reason they give is impact. And my hypothesis here is that they feel they can have a bigger impact in the environment through different behaviors than necessarily just giving philanthropically. So we'll see if I'm right in 5 years. Give me a couple of years on that one.
That's interesting. I'll say just from the families that I've worked with over the last couple of years, that really resonates. I just over and over and over. I'm seeing the younger generation come in with an interest in environment and climate when that hasn't traditionally been what those dads have been giving to. So that's fascinating that's really a true trend, a true thing. So Sarah, you touched on this earlier, and I would love to hear you expand on it, but can you just talk about some of the biggest challenges that families face when they're trying to do this kind of estate planning, and what advice do you have to help make it easier?
That's a great question. I feel like with all of this data and understanding that the values are changing, right? I think there are a lot of conflicts, I would say, in views and ideas. And so I think what we see a lot in the estate planning side and also on the consulting side is that the generation who is coming to do their planning, so maybe it's like G1 or G2, depending on how long the family has been involved with planning and doing philanthropy, they often don't necessarily know what to do with their assets and if their kids want to be part of it. And I think they don't necessarily want to have the conversation, and maybe the kids don't necessarily want to say, hey, parents, family, I'm not interested in like this building with our name on it. Like, I would rather we be contributing to these other causes. And I think where we sometimes run into roadblocks, where maybe we've all seen this, is just a difference in thoughts and ideas about that. And I think I've always kind of come up with the situation of what is the best way to bring people together so that they can hear each other and at least understand where they're coming from and maybe find some common ground. One way in particular that I think has been very helpful is for the older generations to be able to have the space to share how they gained their assets. And if it's a family business or an enterprise, or maybe a collection of artwork, or whatever the asset is, for them to be able to explain their story. Because I think sometimes the younger kids, they're like in school, life is very fast, the youngest ones, right? And they're kind of like, I'm a person of the people. I don't necessarily, that name, oh, I don't know who that is. Meanwhile, like, that's their family. And they don't want to be part of they don't want to be part of the class that's ruling and opposing. And it's so interesting to hear them. And so if they kind of understood that actually it's not just that building, with what the blood, the sweat, the tears, the dreams, how everyone had to work and what the story was, I think then they can start to have an understanding and an appreciation of actually this is a gift. It's not really like an obligation or a chore that I have to give this money away and I don't know what to do with it and I don't deserve this money. Then they can kind of rally around what the story is of how they got to where they are. And then maybe we look at each of the generations and allow them to talk and actually be heard, I think is the key, about what philanthropic endeavors are important to them and why. And then we can start to look at the common ground. And I think the key here is the time and the space to have that conversation. And I don't honestly think that necessarily happens in the attorney's office, because we all know the clock is ticking, or there was an estimate for a job, but that didn't really include having the whole family and a series of meetings where everyone felt heard. And so that would be my advice, though, is to share the story, because I think we're all interested in the story and it gives meaning to something that maybe some of the generations are taking for granted, that they think is just there. And from that place of meaning, then we can kind of like get a vision and a shared values And I'm gonna say, and you've seen it too, it's probably not gonna be one thing that everyone agrees upon, but they may agree on, like a way that they're gonna agree on the bigger thing. And then maybe they're all gonna have a little, their own fund that they give to the causes that are important to them. But there are lots of creative ways if there's the time and the space and the open, honest conversation. I found. Thank you.
Julie, I'm gonna throw another generation into this. You have younger grandchildren. Can you talk about whether you've discussed with your own children the ways to introduce their children to philanthropy, and just what would you see your philanthropic legacy being over these multiple?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I really wanted to prepare for this conversation. And so it really spurred me on to set aside a little time with each of my kids separately. We weren't able to do that all three together. And I think it's not, my son has a 9-month-old, and they're just so much in a flurry of things. So that wasn't what we talked about. But my daughter has my grandson Cal is going to be 7 in August. And so it really did spur on a very thoughtful conversation. We kind of she reflected on what giving had been like for her when she was young, and that there really was, whatever her dimes and quarters were that went to UNICEF or that sort of thing. That was kind of what it looked like. And then, I think both my kids just see this opportunity as a huge gift and a huge responsibility. So they're taking it really seriously. And so Gwynnie was, kind of brainstorming and really thinking that she could involve Cal, at any point really soon, and start having him kind of part of her process, and maybe even having a small amount of money that he can, start to think through and do some research, and obviously with help. And but yeah, she was just very enthusiastic about giving that attention starting now. So like I said, I think the aspect of a gift and a responsibility is very big for both of the kids, and so I think that they will do a great job in passing along that perspective.
Great. Holly, you spoke earlier about some of the different ways that the younger generation gives, some of the approaches that they take. One area that I'm curious about is how they may be approaching diversity, equity, and inclusion, something that we're hearing a lot about today. So could you speak a little bit to where that fits for the younger generation?
So we've seen huge growth in the last 5, 6, 7 years in giving towards organization whose case has a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this could be an independent school that's looking to expand a certain program to better serve all students, for example. But we've seen organizations who have a focus, no matter what sector they're in. So they could be in arts, they could be in services, they could be in education. That's been really important, and particularly to younger generations. So we've seen that. We've seen it play out in a couple different ways. I'll start with foundations, and I'm so proud to have grown up in Denver, and we talk a lot about the good work that the Denver Foundation is really leading nationally in some of those conversations. But practices that foundations are taking first is, for a long time, it was by invitation. So organizations could apply if they were invited to apply. That requires access, a seat at the table, and a lot of foundations have gone to more of an open call, for example. Something else that we're seeing and really has been pushed by younger generations is eliminating tedious reporting. So there was a big phase, I would say, 2008, and a little bit on both sides, where nonprofits or business, and we want the same metrics that we would for a financial investment that we're making in other sectors, right? Well, what this does is for small, lean staff, it's incredibly time consuming and resource intensive. So it's taking the work out of community, out of the impact and into bundling messaging the impact that they're having. So a lot of donors are doing unrestricted trust-based giving. They're looking at the leadership of organizations. So what is the board composition in this organization? If this is an organization that's working in communities of color, is the leadership representative of the community? And they're looking at metrics like that more so than requiring stringent reporting, which has been interesting. And I think a lot of other sectors are following suit because the precedent that they're setting.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask all three of you to answer the same question, and we'll just go down the table. And this is the question that's going to lead into you all asking your questions. So be thinking about that while we're having this conversation. But I wonder if you could talk about a gift or, in your case, Julie, a grant that you may have made to an organization that was particularly meaningful to you and to your family, and how that came to be. What were the factors that made that so meaningful? Were they some of the organizational components that you've been talking about? Were they some of the history that you've been talking about? Were they some of the relational pieces that Julie's been talking about? Just, kind of describe that for us. Take us into it. I'll start with Sarah.
Okay, I was like, oh, I thought you would describe. So, in our family, one of the organizations actually that my husband works with, he consults on philanthropy, is the Sorara Foundation, and they work with indigenous tribes in Kenya, and we were able to go and visit them, and I was so struck by how wonderful it is to have the philanthropy focused in a place and serving the community and to see the direct benefit. So it's focused on education and the community, and also improving the environment and how to do resource conservation. Just to see a community that's so in such a different I don't even want to say stage of development, because who are we to say that the stages are where like a Western country might be. That's where you're going. Maybe, they're just in a different stage of being, in that they live in communities and they share houses and they have multiple spouses. And so it's like a whole other different world. What really struck me was the fact that they were providing a way for women who had traditionally not had a way to make a living to make funds in their milk to market program. So I loved to see that. And I know it's going to change their community. And I guess there's always that question of when you bring these other ideals into a community that didn't necessarily have it, are you enhancing them or are you changing them? Would they have changed already? But I just love the way that they were able to have so many, the elephant sanctuary allow the women to sell the goat's milk for the elephant. So it's like such a great system. And I could go on, but we are limited on time. So I'm happy to put on it. Actually,
We'll just send it over to Polly.
Julie, I couldn't tell if you were sitting in between us or to my left.
No.
You're next.
This is one of my favorite questions that we talk to a lot when we work with campaign cabinets and things like that. We'll start the discussion in this way. So it's fun to reflect on our own giving. I have 2 small children, and I love hearing about different ways to bring them into the conversation. And so this was not our biggest gift, and I learned that there are some complications in the giving that was happening, but I loved it because it was her idea. So we were driving downtown Denver, and she was commenting on how many people there were without homes. And so we were having a discussion about what was going on and the various reasons And I'm reading a story to her that night, and she said, you know, I'd be really thirsty. It's hot, and I'd be really thirsty. Where do you get water? And again, opens up a really nice conversation. So it was her idea, and she wanted to put together bags, so just paper bags with chapstick, and she picked what went in there, goldfish, because it's her favorite snack. I've learned this is a complicated practice and not always smiled upon, but when we would see someone who was in need, she would roll down her window and give her that. And I think just the eye contact in this story and the awareness, we live in some central Denver, but have a very different reality. So it felt like an age appropriate way to bring her into the solutions, have her come up with her own ideas for how she could share that love for humankind. So it was a moment as a mother that felt like we were on the right track in some of those conversations. I will say personally, I have worked with a lot of organizations in Denver, and each one are my favorite organization for a very different reason. But I worked for about 3 years with an independent school here in Denver, and their student body, just an awesome community. And their motto is the way you learn best. So really, my background's in education. I was a 3rd grade teacher, and they talk about how bright every single one of their students are, but they may need the teachers to show up in a different way and provide them something different. So they have this beautiful campus in Denver, but had some real needs. They have a performing arts, they have great arts, but it was in an old cafeteria, and everyone was scrunched in. So, you know, one parent could come, grandma was not allowed. They did a campaign at some point of no room for grandmother, was like the campaign name, is they looked to build to be performing arts. So they just hit 25 million, so they just exceeded their goal. The stage in my life I'm at, I'm not going to be their mega donor, but I talk a lot with my clients about sort of the quiet phase and then the public phase, where you're really inviting everyone in to get them over their goal. So I recently made my contribution to that campaign that I worked on for a long time, and doors are open, lights are on, and there's just this energy around it. So it was really fulfilling to see, you know, where the grandmothers were not invited to a place where they have this awesome theater where kids can shine.
Julie, how about you?
Well, let's see. I have, I guess, different than what Sarah said, I have been very much focused on environment and climate for the last couple of years. And I've been really feeling my way and, you know, giving some donations to the really big places, like, let's say in the Environmental Defense Fund, I know was one of them. And in the process of that, I realized how it just wasn't very satisfying for me. So, and also in the process, I started to really hone in on what aspect of that was important, because it's, you know, as Sarah was saying, it's such a huge problem, and how do you actually create impact? And so my focus evolved to regenerative agriculture, and I've just done a lot of learning and studying about that. And then not quite a year ago, I just ran into this organization that is local to the Boulder area where I live, and they're called the Dryland Agroecology Research. And I started to look into what they were doing, and it just sounded so lined up with the things that I'm interested in. How do you take just a beaten up, non-productive piece of land and turn it into something that creates food and sequesters lots of carbon and holds onto water, and that's really what they were doing. So I had a conversation with Claire not too long ago, Claire Tobin at the Denver Foundation, and she said that there was a committee that would actually sort of look into organizations that as grantors that we're interested in, and kind of establish that they're legit. And so I got a good report back on these folks. I was able to, my husband and I went to a volunteer night. So we spent a couple hours pulling weeds. I learned so much about plants. I mean, all these really mostly young people were just experts in like what all the weeds were good for, this ailment and that ailment. And it was just wonderful. And just all of the techniques that they're using there's just so much conversation about that. So I learned a lot and was pretty well decided I was going to do some kind of grant. And just this last week got a message from them that they are pulling their donors together this weekend, in fact, to really involve donors in kind of evolving their direction. And so for me, again, I think it was maybe something that Polly said about how the younger generation wants to get involved in different ways. I'm not part of the younger generation, but I do like to be involved, whether it's volunteering or just, being in conversation. And so it's just moving in such a nice direction. I'm really excited about it. They're reaching out further and further to more and more landowners. And I think even Boulder County that just has so much work to do in terms of restoring a lot of their open space. And so that's it. I'm just real excited. And, they won't be my only grantee, but I'm looking forward to learning and being involved with them and really seeing some differences made in that arena of climate. And yeah.
Lovely, thanks, Julie. So what questions do you all have? What are you curious about? Yeah, Linda.
I'm thinking about the actual mechanisms. Like what different ways, structurally, I guess, that you could involve the different generations or your younger kids, I guess.
A great question. Hold me to answer an actual question, but I'm going to give you some context. One of the data points that just came out is 10% of all giving is online giving now. And what they're seeing is a lot of the initial is through social media. So whether it's Instagram, otherwise, or on phones, but people are actually making the gifts on laptops or computers, which I think is interesting when they're sort of sitting. Cryptocurrency is something that we continue to get questions about of how we're looking at our policies. Can our organization receive crypto, right? We take a number of different assets. What does that look like? We were just, Bonnie, who I work with, and I were just looking at a report, and one thing that stood out is younger donors want to be asked to give. So 50% in this particular survey, smaller sample size, but 50% said we want to be asked more from organizations. So interesting to think about how are you bringing, I'm thinking about environmental organizations, how are you bringing younger donors into the conversations, and then how are you asking them to give and stewarding that gift to show that it has an impact, that their dollars are helping being applied towards a solution there. Does that answer your question? Does it start to?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking even just within the Denver Foundation, like is it common that people are setting up separate funds for their kids, or, yeah, that way is what what options are there, I guess?
I mean, I guess I could answer that just from, the perspective of our family. And my kids are grown, but we have one fund and we're each signed up as whatever the name is, probably a grantor. And so we're each able to go into it and make our grants. We're able to see what the other has done. And it's been really quite seamless. That's worked really well for us. And it is online, as I'm sure you know.
Donor advised funds are one of the largest, fastest growing areas of impact. So we're seeing, and more organizations are understanding how to work best with Dace.
And you can't really give online through your DAP. I mean, I guess you can do the donor portal, but I'm just saying through social media, you couldn't really give through
Right.
social media.
I
Through
don't
a
think we have
DAP.
I don't think we have a social media mechanism, but you can give online to your donor advised fund. I would say we more commonly, to your first question, we more commonly have folks that are working in the way that Julie is working, where you're setting up an informal mechanism to make your decisions. But we can obviously accommodate whatever a family's desires are. And so if it makes more sense based on the way that the family feels like they want to divide their giving, to set up multiple funds, whether those are donor advised funds, scholarship funds, right? I mean, the kind of myriad of ways that people give at the Denver Foundation. We're able to work with families to do that. Yeah, other questions?
I'm Lorraine Higby and I went to grade school with Julie.
Lorraine, I thought I saw you walk in. I'm so sorry I'm not there to give you a big hug.
Yeah, we haven't seen each other in a while. And Sarah, you really spoke to this, but I just know if there's any more to flesh out about how to use giving and philanthropy as a way, like my children are just becoming aware, they've just received some of these inheritances and they're just college and graduating from college, and it's like how to really use philanthropy to inspire responsibility to at a bigger level, as opposed to the big fear that this is just a free ride, someday we're going to have this free ride. But I don't know if there's any nuances of fleshing out how to really accent the philanthropy to inspire them.
Well, I think that that's a great question, and I really do feel your kids are in college. I really do feel that all along the way there are chances and opportunities, kind of like you both were talking about. If you're starting when they have kids, for example, and doing what Julie was talking about, and also Julie and also Polly, and starting in at that young level. And I also think that, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to sit with the kids and say, let's all talk about what's important, because you guys can each take your inheritance and decide to do something with it. But what if we all were interested in something, and maybe like a common cause where we could kind of pool our money in a way and have a bigger impact, and maybe even use it as a way to inspire them and have them inspire their friends as well, who are in their same age range, to have that awareness, and maybe even use it as an opportunity to not only. Okay.
Sorry, we turn this off.
But it also, I think, is a wonderful opportunity to not only give funds, but also rally around a cause in terms of actually boots on the ground volunteering, because I feel like that brings a whole other element of purpose to what is happening. So I do think having that discussion and seeing what can be done is good. And I love the idea of, if they have kids, because I know the college age kids are kind of saying, we don't know if we want to bring anyone into this world. So I don't know that now would be the time to bring that up, but I think it's a wonderful thought to maybe say, what if a portion of these funds were set aside for children of the next generation, even if they're not yours, you didn't have them, but maybe the nieces and nephews and friends in the community could maybe sponsor giving across the board, even in their communities, where they could bring in people in the community. And that, I know that, and I would love to hear what you think, Polly, but I know that community-based giving and is growing in traction. I don't know the numbers though.
I really appreciate that question. The thing that came to mind too is organizations need to do a great job of bringing the whole family in, so thanking for the gifts and inviting in for whether whatever that means, either but sharing those stories so that you see full circle the impact of those conversations. That's something we consistently challenge our clients with. Not just did you raise the money, but how did you thank them? How did you share the stories and the impact of that? And I think that's such a powerful way to bring the whole family together, whether that's through a site visit, whether that's through reading impact stories and impact reports, watching the videos to see that piece. I would say where my mind went to was I started fundraising. We often talk about, I don't know anyone who says at age 20, I want to be a fundraiser when I grow up. You come into that work, and a lot of times you work on the program side of a nonprofit and you see the need for philanthropy, and that this is really part of the fuel that enables that programmatic piece. So I started in 2008, a terrible time to start in fundraising, but I think anyone who could spell fundraising wasn't answering the phone at that time for paid campaigns. So I started in 2008 at an education nonprofit here in Colorado called Teach for America, and we had a program called Sponsor a Teacher program. And what I remember so clearly was families, and it didn't cover the full cost of the teacher training or anything like that, but it helped offset the training and support of the teacher. And families would invite teachers in who were working in Aurora Public Schools, Denver Public Schools, and oftentimes they had their high school age kids at the table for those conversations and for those dinners. They would invite them over, they would sponsor them, and then invite them over for dinner. And the conversations that happened at those dinner tables, I would imagine stuck with these high school age students for a really long time, not only in terms of sort of the contribution, but also thinking about what they want to do, right? And how they want to shape their values philanthropically and from a career standpoint. So I think this isn't, I'm making it sound really simple, but the conversations and the impact stories and bringing younger generations into inviting them to the dinner table to have those discussions, I think is really powerful.
I have a couple questions about the data. What is the relationship between volunteering and then financial philanthropy, especially in the younger generations? What are we seeing there? And then also in the government giving, you know, in terms of the non-philanthropic, but, you know, for government giving and then philanthropy, and how does that data look?
Yeah, great question. So the first one around the volunteering piece, we're finding the donors who are most engaged are getting the most consistently. And we also see, you've probably heard this, but oftentimes people are considering legacy gifts, so considering nonprofits in their state plans and wills. They aren't always the $1 million donor, but they're the donor who's given $100 a year consistently. For a long time, we're working with a school in rural Colorado, and they just got a significant 7-figure gift. This is an alumni, he passed away. His wife sent a beautiful letter about how they met on this campus. And he just did give them small gifts over the years and over time, but it was such a lasting sort of part of their life. So I think of it in terms of the same way with volunteer. The more engagement, the more you can bring people in to be at the table and to have an impact in problem, whether it's through time, whether it's through philanthropic dollars. We also see people who volunteer early on. So maybe their budget isn't one where they're giving a lot philanthropically because they're, you know, taking the bus at that point in their life. You're planting the seed for their giving habits in 10 or 15 years as their wages increase and things like that. So I think of volunteering as you're setting the stage.
But even in the younger generations who are on their handheld and on the internet and not going outside as much, you're still seeing that there's a big correlate, that they are volunteering, and that if they volunteer, they're the great one.
It's such a good question. And I think we need a little bit of time. I think we're going to understand this better in 5 years when we can really see the trends. But I will say that younger generation is thinking about the overall involvement in a movement, right? So that may be showing up for the Women's March on Colfax, for example, then giving to Planned Parenthood, then giving sort of a wraparound approach to supporting movements that they're interested in. But this is another one, I want to see the data in 5 years to sort of see how that plays out. It's a really good question.
And do you want to, just as a last thing, respond to the question about government giving versus individual philanthropic giving?
I intentionally avoided that one. So a couple things. We have, I'm gonna give 2 answers. We have seen this play out in 2 different ways. So we worked with a large public hospital that got significant public funding for a project. There was a lot of discussion on the board table. Is this an asset or is this a challenge philanthropically? So the 2 sides of this are, one, donors are looking at it as this is a reliable, there's a holistic funding mechanism to realize this vision. And it's private philanthropy, there's public support for this. There's a sustainable model to support not only the capital project they were looking at, but also programmatically for the long term, right? The flip side of it is I think oftentimes you have to really make the message clear that no matter what type of government funding that you're receiving, that doesn't negate the need for philanthropy, right? So oftentimes an organization will get great public. I'll give another example. It's not government funding, but Mackenzie Scott. So we work with a number of different organizations locally and nationally who received really generous support from Mackenzie Scott. The first reaction was, this is absolutely incredible. The second reaction was, are major donors going to think we don't need money, right? Because we just got $3 million from Mackenzie Scott. We just got $10 million from Mackenzie Scott. And I think there's that same conversation happening. I think people are asking different questions when organizations are receiving government funding. So just being prepared to show it, how that fits into the overall strategy and sustainability and impact of the organization is key. Thank you.
Well, let's thank our panelists. And thanks to each of you for coming today. We hope that you'll stay with us for the second part of our time together, and just engage in some conversation and some refreshments. Thank you again for being engaged with the Denver Foundation.